I'm delighted to introduce our paper, Limiting the Use of Cash for Big Purchases, Assessing the Case for Uniform Cash Thresholds, which is written in collaboration with the Mossavar Rahmani Centre for Business and Government at Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Despite electronic advancements, cash still plays a key role in money laundering, tax evasion and terrorist financing, with the FATF estimating that the amount of money laundered annually through the smuggling of cash across international borders to be between hundreds of billions and $1 trillion per year. And to put this figure in perspective, the total value of cash outstanding in the world amounts to around $4 trillion. Purchases of high-value goods offer illicit actors the ability to integrate their cash into the legitimate economy without raising AML flags. And this is why high-denomination banknotes are disproportionately used for illegal activities, and why a significant share of large cash transactions are likely to be connected to illicit activities. Cash thresholds, which have already been introduced in some countries and are currently a matter of debate at the European Commission, appear to offer the potential to constrain the use of cash for large-scale money laundering and tax evasion, with minimal downside for ordinary citizens. Yet any policy proposal that curtails the use of cash generates controversy, given both the potential disruption to normal economic activity and personal privacy concerns. So given this potential for controversy, we've decided to debate this topic with all of you this morning. And it is now my pleasure to introduce the three esteemed panellists. To my right, we have my co-author, Peter Sands, who is a research fellow at the Mossavar Rahmani Centre for Business and Government, Harvard Kennedy School, where he focuses his research on topics related to financial markets and regulation and the financing and economics of global health. Prior to this appointment, he was the Group CEO of Standard Chartered. To his right is Brett Scott, an independent consultant and researcher in the field of alternative finance and financial reform. He is author of the Heretic Guide to Global Finance, produced the 2016 UNRISD report on blockchain technology, and has worked with a wide range of NGOs, student groups and startups on new approaches to financial systems. And finally, Riondet is the head of financial intelligence at Europol, where he is responsible for the entire spectrum of financial investigations, from money laundering, asset recovery to cooperation between the EU FIUs. So I will now ask the panellists to speak for around 10 minutes each, hopefully giving us plenty of time for questions. Peter?
Okay. I'll give you, in a nutshell, the argument of the paper. It starts from the premise, as Haylea said, that cash plays a very significant role in financial crime. For the very simple reason it is the most effective technology if you are a criminal, because it is anonymous and leaves no transaction record and is acceptable everywhere. And so, as a recent Europol report put it, cash is king in the eyes of criminals. It's also a very effective tool if you want to do tax evasion. There's plenty of evidence that probably the biggest gap in tax collection across Europe is, and in many other countries, is sales tax or VAT evasion, and most of that is cash-based. It's people paying in cash, people receiving cash for services. That said, I am not, and it's often characterized as anybody who wants to put constraints on the use of cash are trying to get rid of cash. I am not a believer in trying to sort of drive for the cashless society. I think cash still plays an enormously useful role, particularly in smaller transactions and in informal settings. And there are very legitimate concerns about privacy and so on that I think are militate against pushing too hard for a drive towards a cashless society, which is not to say that we shouldn't think about where cash is most optimal for society and where there are some downsides to it. And the downsides of cash mainly come when we're talking about large movements of cash, large transactions paid in cash, large amounts of cash being stored or moved around the world. Because that is what people who either want to evade large amounts of tax or want to conduct organized crime are doing, is they're using cash to either inject their proceeds into the legitimate economy or to pay each other or to store or move their ill-gotten gains. Now, there are various things you can do to tackle the illicit use of cash, and all the time you're thinking about what is the impact on the criminal world and how to minimize the impact on legitimate economic activity. One thing that's been done is eliminating high denomination notes, and one of the most recent things is the announcement that the ECB is going to stop issuing the 500 euro note. You can impose reporting requirements. When you take 10,000 euro across the border, you have to report that. You can promote electronic alternatives. The Scandinavian countries have been very quick to find ways of encouraging people to use electronic alternatives. You can use a combination of these things. The paper argues that cash thresholds can be a very useful complement to these other sorts of measures. What's the case in favour of them? Well, the start is there's very limited downside, because the reality is most people in their everyday lives are not using cash to make transactions of over, say, £2,000–3,000, right? This is not something you do every day. The economic impact of telling people that they can't do it is going to be extremely small, and indeed the impact on their sort of privacy and personal lives is going to be extremely small. There is an argument about privacy. I want to be able to buy something with £3,000 without somebody knowing what I'm up to. But the reality is, when you think about what you buy with £3,000, normally it is something that has a title, a contract, some sort of personal information associated. It's a vehicle, it's a holiday, it's medical services. Your privacy is not absolute around that in any case. The second issue, the argument is that it will have an impact on money laundering and tax evasion. Now, this is quite difficult to prove, because although cash thresholds have been imposed in a number of countries, there's been very little systematic analysis of impact. And one of the things we suggest in the paper is one could do a much better job of analysing what the impact is of imposing such policies. And you could do it, particularly with VAT. You could analyse patterns of VAT receipts in a much more systematic fashion. We think they can be used quite well to complement other tools. In some countries, they will be easier to implement politically than, say, getting rid of high denomination notes. And they could replace some of the more onerous and largely ineffective reporting requirements. And you can also do it in a very calibrated way. You could, if you're worried about the economic impact of imposing one at £2,000, you could do it at £4,000 and then analyse the impact and see whether to move it. And indeed, that's exactly what France did. It started with a limit at €3,000 and brought it down to €1,000. The paper talks as well about the argument for setting uniform cash thresholds. I think it's worth saying that the argument for setting uniform cash thresholds is not as strong as the argument for setting cash thresholds. The reason you would set uniform is because otherwise you get regulatory arbitrage across borders. That's most prevalent, and there is evidence of this, in a common currency area like the Eurozone. So you have criminals deciding that they may have made their money in Belgium, but because Belgium has cash thresholds, it's easier to launder the money in Germany, which doesn't have cash thresholds. So there is a logic. I don't think that necessarily they have to be absolutely the same, but as with all regulatory arbitrage, the cleaner you can get it, the less arbitrage you get. What are the arguments against imposing cash thresholds? There's a fundamental one about this is a restriction on consumer freedom and an invasion of privacy, and there's a lot of discussion around that. My riposte to that is simply that in the world of fighting crime, you're always making trade-offs between the invasion of and constraints on human liberty and the efficacy of being able to fight crime. And this is one where it seems like the balance is fairly compelling in terms of giving us a benefit in terms of constraining the illicit use of cash. And actually, given that most people, most of the time, aren't spending €2,000–3,000 or pounds in cash, and the downside of doing it with a credit card or a cheque seems relatively limited, this does not feel like a huge constraint. But this excites quite a lot of passion, and I'm sure we'll hear some more of that. There's an argument that says, well, it won't have any impact because criminals will break the law anyway. You know, if you add another law that they're breaking, what difference does it make? I think the difference is that it's the recipient who is now also breaking the law. So if I'm somebody who has £3,000 or €3,000 illegally, and I go into a shop, I may have stolen that money, so I may not care that I'm breaking another law, but the shop might now care that it is now complicit. So you're creating a different sort of constraint on the money laundering activity. At the moment, the shop is just happy to take 3,000, and the reality is quite a lot of them are quite incentivized to do it because it makes it easier to avoid VAT. There's an argument about disproportionate impact on certain segments. Many people talk about the impact on the poor. I mean, the reality is the poor aren't making this kind of value of transaction. I think that's a completely misconstrued argument. There is more of a legitimate argument around tourists, and indeed some countries have set a different limit for tourists versus residents on the basis that sometimes tourists, particularly if they're coming from places where MasterCard and Visa and so on aren't operative, their credit cards might not work and all this sort of stuff. And so there is a bit of an argument around that. There's an argument by some that cash is technically superior. It doesn't need electricity. It's acceptable everywhere. It's very simple. You don't have to explain how to use it. And those arguments, I think, have some weight, but they're fundamentally true at very low levels of payment. So when you're paying for something for £5 or €5 or €3 or something, or you're trying to give a child pocket money. Giving a child pocket money is one instance where cash is probably the superior technology, but you don't typically give them a couple of thousand, and so I don't really see that as a relevant constraint. So that is the essence of the argument. There's a sort of robust underlying logic. Cash plays a very important role in the business models of people who are doing criminal activity, evading tax, are corrupt, or financing terrorism. We think it's most likely to have an impact on tax evasion and money laundering. Relatively limited direct impact on terrorist finance, simply because terrorist finance doesn't involve huge amounts of money. And it won't have any impact on petty crime, because petty crime goes below the levels we're talking about. There really isn't, I think, much downside either in terms of privacy or impact on legitimate economic activity. It's a relatively simple thing to implement. It would make sense within a currency area like the Eurozone to have them at broadly similar levels. You could argue from a communication point of view it would be easier to do it at the same level, but if you want to give member states some discretion, it probably doesn't matter to have them at broadly similar ones. There is a strong case for having much better tracking of impact. A, because it helps you make the argument, and B, because over time you could refine the calibration of them if you were analyzing the impact. And the kind of analysis where we were thinking about is things like you could take luxury goods stores, you could examine their VAT receipts before implementation of a cash threshold, and you could examine them after implementation of a cash threshold. And that could be pretty interesting. And you could even do pilots where you do some with and some without and see what happens. That's all I was going to say.
That's all. Thank you very much. Brett, would you like to respond?
Sure. You guys hear me? Fine. So my name's Brett Scott. I have many different incarnations, but I wrote this book, The Heretic's Guide to Global Finance, which is not really on this particular issue, but I work a lot in money systems and alternative money systems, and also quite involved in the sort of the cryptocurrency blockchain technology community, which actually sort of plays into this debate to some extent in certain ways. But more recently, I've written a couple of articles which were very popular among certain communities. One was called The War on Cash. Another was called In Praise of Cash, where I was sort of sketching out essentially the negative sides of cashless society. Because on the other, I also work in the fintech community, and in the fintech community there's basically an incredibly uncritical and self-interested drive to push for a cashless society for purely commercial reasons. And the fintech industry also has a lot of commercial or sort of media power. And one of the questions to ask is also why these debates about cashlessness are suddenly emerging right now. There's been a lot of this stuff in the media and the press and all over the place. And large part is because the fintech industry is actually rising in political and economic power. And suddenly these ideas are seeping into the public. So those articles were sketching out some of those dynamics. And I read this paper, and one of the interesting things about it is it's trying to position itself as being a kind of middle way, saying we recognize the negative implications of cashless society, of which there are a whole sort of range of them. But we also are trying to balance this off with, trying to deal with crime, and we're presenting the middle way, which will somehow be the best of both worlds. And I guess I have a slight sort of meta critique of it. I mean, I kind of agree with that perspective in many ways. I have no inherent problem with the concept of cash thresholds. But the way this paper is actually set up, I would argue, is playing directly into the hands of people who are trying to push for cashless society. And in a sense, it's not holistic, and it will not be received in a holistic fashion. So if you're thinking about this cash threshold issue, ideally what you want to be doing is to have a negative account of the cash system balanced against a negative account of the digital money system, and then the threshold hovers somewhere in between it. Actually, what this paper does is gives a negative account of the cash system, but no real negative account of the digital money system. All right, so the sort of opposite side is like the kind of like benefits of cash for small transactions. There's no actual critique of the digital money system in this paper at all. So really what's been set up there is like cash is negative, digital's kind of cool, but people still like using cash. So let's put these like thresholds at this point. So this is essentially how you would implement a cashless society. So I would call this actually a ratcheting mechanism. You're setting the levels and then setting them up to then go lower and lower and lower. All right? Rather than putting a lower bound that will push up at the same time, which requires essentially a critique of the digital finance sector. And actually the paper tries to argue that, so it actually mentions that there's this issue of people arguing that there's going to be a kind of a slippery slope that occurs. If you start to put these thresholds, they'll start to push down. And it says that this is not really a risk, but actually the paper itself kind of argues for that slippery slope. One of the actual headings in it is cash thresholds can initially be calibrated to minimize the perceived downside risk, aka set them in a way that doesn't cause political controversy, and then reduced over time. Now maybe I'm taking it slightly out of context, but I'm sure there'll be many people who will take that out of context as well. For example, the extremely powerful financial technology industry and the banks themselves, who also have incentives to push for this particular situation. So there's this kind of like, I guess maybe a slightly, the example of the Indian demonetization is given as a very bad example, or as a very bad like attempt to try and implement some kind of cashless thing, and it's like they try to rip cash out and then try to then like sort of justify it by saying, we're moving to a cashless society, but don't actually have the digital finance infrastructure in place, and it's a big debacle. Actually, a sophisticated way that you would implement a cashless society is precisely through cash thresholds slowly being ratcheted down. So you make it politically acceptable. And you can see the mechanisms via which this occurs. And you can see this without even cash thresholds occurring. You essentially demonize cash at many levels. You set the threshold, which in turn seeps out into the media, further pushing this idea that cash is essentially a negative, outdated form. This is then contrasted with the positive presentation of digital as a kind of futuristic, unproblematic form. And then banks themselves and these various types of people will use this as a justification for why they start to reduce cash services, which in turn will make the actual cash infrastructure degrade, which will make cash more inconvenient to use, which will inspire people to use digital more, which will then be used as a justification for why people no longer want to use cash. So there's these kind of like ratcheting circular effects, which will then you'll use to justify why you can pull the cash threshold down further. And this is what's essentially going to happen. So right now, this seems very reasonable, but 10 years hence, this debate will have moved on, and these will be pushed down. And there are also other sort of slippery slope elements to this. I mean, the paper even mentions stuff like, some criminal responses, for example, might be, okay, well, we'll start to break our money laundering attempts down to smaller chunks, right? 5 years hence, that will now be the new justification for lowering the cash threshold. Criminals have now figured out that they can do some kind of, unless you've solved the underlying causes of crime, I'm assuming they can still have this the underlying need to find these ways to launder money. And that will then be part of the new push for the reduced or ratcheting down of the cash threshold level. I just want to maybe just the last point, just to reiterate this point that this report will be received in the context of the growing power of the digital finance industry. All right, and the fintech industry isn't essentially a competitor to the banks. You have to see it in the holistic context of the banking sector. It's essentially the automation of the financial system. The fintech sector essentially operates as a kind of outsourced R&D department for the banks, and they kind of get absorbed into the banking sector. And it's basically operating on different elements of how do you automate finance, from essentially how do you automate the jobs of financial professionals through to how do you essentially automate the user experience layer of finance. That's basically what the fintech industry is. And this is there's an inherent drive within the banking sector to push this, all right, because you cut costs via this mechanism, and you can deal at scale with large numbers of people by automating. So there is an inherent drive in society to push towards this type of system, and any of these types of reports really need to be very strictly put in that context, and it should be noted those interests behind that and how they will use this. So if I was going to make a recommendation, I kind of agree with the report, but I think it's missing a big chunk of a critique of the digital financial sector and how there needs to be a very strong need for putting some kind of lower bound in this. Otherwise, this will be used essentially as the justification to ratchet down towards this cashless society. And I can elaborate more maybe in questions.
Thank you very much. And Simon, finally, the law enforcement perspective.
Yeah, it's always nice to be in the UK because I kind of see the mix of this always innovative, thought-provoking debate in that kind of very classic atmosphere, and I like the contrast of it. I'd like to zoom out a little on what we're dealing with. Our problem as law enforcement is to fight money laundering and terrorism financing. When it comes to money laundering, our research shown that we only seize 1.1% of the estimated profits of crime. How did we get to this figure? We got to this figure by asking all the asset recovery offices of the EU member states how many and how much would they confiscate, and we compared it to the estimation from quite serious yet Italian institute, and the proceeds of crime were 170 billion. And one might argue that that's probably not true because it's an estimation, but well, just for the UK, the National Crime Agency thinks that quite precisely the money laundering in the UK is between 36 to 90 billion pounds, and the fraud by itself is 193 billion pounds in the UK. So I think, in fact, this estimate is really low. So basically, we're probably seizing much less than 1.1%. So the system is not working. Is there any silver bullet? Of course not. So there's a series of measures that should facilitate our work and therefore help us to make Europe safer and protect our fellow citizens. Some of them are already in place, and basically there's a momentum to try to improve them. There's the compliance regime with initiatives such as the GIMLIT in the UK, trying to give more feedback to the banks in order for them to have a better vision, a better allocation of their resources in order to track illicit money flows. And I think, of course, it's far from being perfect. It's a really costly system that doesn't produce that much, but it's becoming better and better. The second thing is to improve the international cooperation. The entry in force of the fourth anti-money laundering directive makes now mandatory for the FIUs, the Financial Intelligence Unit, to share information relevant to other member states, meaning that now we have to share the information that could be vital to criminal or counterterrorism investigation. And this is becoming better and better. With in the future, very very soon, hopefully, every country, every law enforcement in every country being able to access central bank registers, and therefore being able to identify who's behind the transaction more swiftly. Everything we're doing, every of those two, the improvement of the international cooperation and the improvement of the financial crime compliance regime, are push for criminals to use cash more and more. Basically, criminals like cash because it's kind of easy, it's something tangible, and what we see, what we've acknowledged in the last years is that they want tangible things. They want things that they can understand. And by the way, even though the understanding on virtual currencies is improving in the public, it's far from being really understood by criminals. That's the reason why they're using more and more cash. First way to tackle this criminal use of cash is to try to avoid to have too big highest denomination. And I think what Peter mentioned about the 500 euro banknote is a really interesting first step, because there is no reason to have such an huge value in such a small piece of paper, because basically no one uses it on a daily basis, and any type of transaction could be done with, let's say, 50 or 100 euro banknotes. And there are lots of countries, the US don't even really use the $100. In the UK, from my understanding, the 50 pound is not that much used on a daily basis. So basically, that's the first push for them to not to be able to transport, because you know that they smuggle those 500 euro banknotes. They are even swallowing it because of its value, like they're swallowing cocaine or heroin. The second, we can put on cash for criminals are those thresholds. First of all, I think an important threshold is the cash declaration that is now mandatory when entering the Eurozone, above 10,000 euros. It's accepted, and it's accepted because it doesn't make any sense to transport that kind of money without any justification. And this is starting to make criminals' life harder. Of course, that doesn't mean that they won't break this law, but it makes them their life harder. And then there's this question of cash threshold for big purchases. I'm going to tell you about a case that I think really makes this idea a good one. We worked now a little more than 1 year ago on a network of Lebanese money launderers. We call them super facilitators because they work for different types of organized crime networks. They're not specialized in one kind of crime like weapons trafficking or drug trafficking. And we worked them on an angle when they were laundering the profits of a cartel, a Colombian cartel. The estimation, and it was pretty accurate because during their interviews they acknowledged the amounts we had calculated. They laundered around 1 billion per year with this cartel. How did they do? They had all this money from the drug purchase in Europe. They had to pile it. So they came from small denomination to high denomination, and then they had to transport it. And it's really hard to transport cash. So what did they do? They went in a country where there is no cash threshold, Germany in this case, and they buy luxury watches and second-hand luxury cars for major amounts. In 2015 they bought for more than 40 million euros in Rolex, just Rolex. And then they would transport those goods in Middle East and Northern Africa and sell it, taking their percentage, which was 5%, and sometimes with the Rolex, making a little extra because they were able, with their experience, to pick the right ones, the ones that were expected by the consumers. So having a cash threshold in this case would have really hampered their capacity to buy those things. It would have, of course, turned them into another technique. Maybe they would have found another way, but it would have been much more complicated. And we would have had at least reporting of their attempts to use cash for this kind. When discussing with cash strong supporter, and again, I think for me this paper is well balanced in the way that I don't advocate the end of cash. I live in the Netherlands, which is probably one of the most cashless economy in Europe, and sometimes it's kind of difficult not to be able to buy a croissant with cash, but only with a PIN card. But what I want to say is that, of course, the cash supporters say it will only have a small impact on organized crime, like 2 or 3%, according to some studies. Well, that's enough for me. Even 2 or 3% is good when it comes to organized crime. And we haven't spoken about terrorism. In the last 2 years, we have faced around 20 major attacks in Europe, in lots of countries, unfortunately. Would this cash threshold have a strong impact on terrorism? Might be because those Lebanese super facilitators, they were linked to Hezbollah, and a part of their profits was used to purchase weapons used in Syria. So basically what I would say is that it's not a simple question when it comes to terrorism and organized crime, because the line is blurred and there are connections. So any impact that we could have on organized crime might have some further consequences on terrorism also. So for me, anything we can do could be something in favor of being more effective to protect our citizens, our European citizens.
Thank you, and thank you to all the speakers. Well, we've definitely had an interesting debate there, hearing about real-life law enforcement examples and the potential slippery slope towards digital payments and what this means for society. So I would love to hear more of your thoughts on this. If you could just say who you are and who you're affiliated with when you ask your question. We have around 20 minutes.